The good we secure for ourselves is precarious and uncertain until it is secured for all of us and incorporated into common life. This was a sort of motto of Jane's, something that motivated her in her own work, and something she challenged others to live by as well in their work and in their daily lives. Jane Addams, public philosopher, author, women's suffragist activist. She was the founder of Hull House and the American Settlement Movement, the discipline of social work, and the American Civil Liberties Union. She was a charter member of the NAACP. She was also a reformer and activist for immigrant and refugee rights, and in 1931 became the first American woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize. She was kind of a big deal. She is, without question, one of the most inspiring people I can think of. She came from a very comfortable life, and she was a part of the first generation of college-educated women. She gave it all up, however, to embrace the dangerous life of Chicago's most impoverished people. She did not just seek to serve Chicago's poorest, she lived with them. She sought to understand and learn from them as equals. Jane used her connections, education, and status to advocate for her neighbors and friends and embrace the risk entailed in doing so. Risk. It is something our society today fears. So much of our everyday lives is about reducing risk, and for good reason. Car seats help keep children safe and reduce the risk of injury. The Transportation Security Administration scans our bodies, our bags, brings dogs in to smell our computers, and makes us use those tiny little shampoo bottles, all to reduce the risk of a domestic terrorist attack like 9/11. And when exercising or playing a sport, we stretch before and after an activity, or at least we should, to reduce the risk of pulling a muscle or straining our joints. Risk helps us stay safe. Risk helps us make good decisions. But sometimes risk is paralyzing. You say no to the hiking trip because, well, you could twist your ankle. Insurance companies use risk calculations to deny coverage for those who need it most. The risk of rejection and judgment can make us afraid to tell even those closest to us who we love and who we are. Risk can guide us, but risk can also convince us that it is better to live in a bubble, safe from the dangers outside. Today's scriptures have something to teach us about risk. In our first reading, we hear about Jesus once again pressing boundaries and stirring the pot. This time, however, Jesus not only chastises the rich and powerful in private, no, this time he does it in front of everyone inside the temple. And we know that risk is very much a theme of Jesus' existence, which reveals to us a clue to God's workings in the world. The birth of Jesus is the rupture of God into human flesh. Not only is God becoming flesh a risk, but coming to be through childbirth, which even today in many parts of the world is an incredibly risky process. According to the World Health Organization, 830 women die every day from pregnancy or childbirth-related causes. In fact, the U.S. has the highest maternal mortality rate of all industrialized nations, 26.4 deaths per 100,000 births. But God takes this enormous risk to live in the precarity of human existence. Our second reading, however, is about Ruth. Ruth is probably not the first person who comes to mind when we think of risk. We typically think of Moses and David, Joshua and Caleb. Surprising, isn't it, that we think of men? We all know the story of Ruth we've heard it so many times, and we've heard of her profession of love for her mother-in-law read at nearly every wedding we attend. But let's review, just to be sure that we don't miss anything important. Naomi, her husband, and their 2 sons flee a great famine in Bethlehem and settle in Moab. There, her 2 sons marry Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. When tragedy strikes and all of their husbands die, the 3 women find themselves in a dire situation. This would be incredibly difficult and heart-wrenching today, but in Old Testament times, 3 widowed women would have been in a particularly dangerous position. Without the protections of their husbands, the patriarchal society of the day would have left Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth to lives of poverty, isolation, and condemnation. The scriptures are doing something very interesting and very important here. They're directing us to the almost inherent femininity of risk. Hagar, Esther, Mary, Deborah, the poor widow who gave all she had, and Ruth. These women all show us this: the risk of childbearing and childbirth, the risk of barrenness, the risk of being widowed, the risk of poverty, and the risk of stepping outside convention. Risk, in a way, defines a woman's existence, at least in the ancient world, as the Bible portrays it. And God is revealing this to us today through Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah. The scriptures are inviting us to consider risk and womanliness together within God's movement in the world. Aware of their precarious position, Naomi decides it is best for her to return to Bethlehem, to her people, believing that, in the least, this difficult life may be easier in a place where she is not a foreigner. Orpah and Ruth insist on going with her, but Naomi is adamant that they are not to go with her, for they are young and beautiful and can remarry and have good lives in their homeland. Orpah eventually and reluctantly relents and returns to Moab. But Ruth is a bit more stubborn. Though not in our reading this morning, this is the part of the story we know so well. Naomi, Ruth says, standing in the Judean plains between Moab and Bethlehem, where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people. Your God, my God. We focus so much on the love in this passage, a deep love to be sure. But in doing so, we overlook the risk involved in what Ruth is committing to. Ruth is signing up to move to a foreign land as a widow to learn a new culture, a new dialect, a new landscape, and to rely upon the hospitality and kindness of a people who are not her own. But I think this is because Ruth recognizes the risk for Naomi, who is not young and beautiful, who cannot remarry and receive protection, shelter, and food. Ruth stays because if she stays with Naomi, Naomi has a chance. Ruth has passion, and I mean that in the true sense of the word, suffering. She's willing to suffer and fight in order to be with and care for Naomi. She's committed to Naomi and will walk with her in this impossible journey. When they arrive in Bethlehem, the women must glean. Gleaning, you may remember, is the Old Testament version of welfare. When the workers went through the fields and collected everything, they were commanded not to go back over a second time, to leave whatever they missed or whatever wasn't good enough on the first round for the poor, the ostracized, the unclean, and the widowed. With no home, no family protections, and no safety net, Ruth is forced to glean not just for her own, but for Naomi's survival as well. And once again, Ruth is taking a risk. You see, gleaning was typically meant for Israelites, and it's not guaranteed that foreigners would also be allowed to glean. And so Ruth leans on the generosity and pity of the landowner, as well as of her fellow gleaners. But then, Naomi learns that the field belongs to her distant relative, Boaz, and this is where things get exciting. Naomi sees a solution, a path to security, and she becomes a sort of biblical millionaire matchmaker. Naomi advises Ruth to proposition Boaz, as uncovering his feet is very much a euphemism for sexual relations. Her hope is that he will marry Ruth. The stakes are high. This is really their only path out of poverty, and it's Ruth's only chance of having all that Naomi wants for her in life. Ruth takes a slightly different course. Caught once again in an impossible position, Ruth does what she has become so used to doing. She takes a risk. She goes to Boaz, as Naomi advises, but she does not proposition him in quite the same way. Spread your covering over your companion, she tells Boaz. That is, Ruth proposes to Boaz. That's definitely something I had missed on previous readings. As Reverend Dorsan Cooper has pointed out, we often interpret this word as maid or servant or slave, indicating that Ruth is being subservient to Boaz. But it's really more like companion or partner, and she is asserting her equality with him. In addition, in ancient Near Eastern weddings, and some still today, the husband places a covering over the bride's shoulders as a part of the ceremony. So Ruth is very much proposing to Boaz, something, it may not surprise you, was not typical in ancient Judean culture. This is Ruth's risk. In a foreign land, in a foreign culture, and in a world dominated by men, Ruth breaks out of the conventions and limits society has set for her. She is creative, she is clever, and she does not let the fears associated with risk limit her. She instead trusts. She trusts in her mother-in-law, Naomi, whom she loves deeply. And she trusts in Naomi's God. In her work in Chicago, Jane Addams was also motivated by her faith and her belief that what she was doing was God's work. She did not play by the rules society had imposed on her because Jane, like Ruth and like God, was more aware of the precarity of human life than most. She understood that some people have to fight for life, and that risk is a part of everyday existence for many. But just as with Ruth, it is her location at the site of risk combined with the strength she drew from her faith in God that allowed her to break out of the limits of her society and fight for new ways of building just communities of love, to make a way for women in this world. Here at First Baptist Church, we also know about risk. God is leading us down a path with many question marks. We are balancing the pain of moving with the hope of new opportunities. Just as Ruth stood in Judea looking back at Moab, her homeland, and then forward towards Bethlehem, we stand in a moment of change, in a moment of risk. Just as Ruth faced difficulties, we face and are facing difficult challenges. Just as Ruth took risks by thinking outside the governing rules of her society, just as Jane fought to find creative solutions to empower the most marginalized in her society, we too are preparing to take risks, to dream dreams we have never imagined, and to find new ways of ministering to God's people in South End and beyond. What strikes me most about the book of Ruth is the role of agency. At the birth of Ruth and Boaz's son, who is the ancestor of none other than David and eventually Jesus, the women of Bethlehem say the following to Naomi: "Blessed is the Lord who has not left you without a redeemer today. And may his name become famous in Israel. May he also be to you a restorer of life and a sustainer for you of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." They recognize the uniqueness of Ruth. They tell Naomi that she is better than having 7 sons. That is, Ruth, a woman who is not actually Naomi's daughter, is better than her having the perfect amount of sons. Wow. There is power in these words because there is power in these women. The book of Ruth is not just a story about women. It is a story that is driven and told by women. It is a story that teaches men the risks of being a woman, and more importantly, that God resides in that risk. That God is womanly in this way, in taking risks to better the world. Amen.